Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and thanks to the Development Office for giving me the opportunity to present this talk on E.M. Forster, Residence and Reciprocity, hosted by King's College. I am Patricia Mcguire, the Archivist at King's, and as such, I have the pleasure of working with and for our esteemed speaker today. This is an online event. I will introduce a webinar talk by the fellow librarian Peter Jones, which will last 45 minutes or so, and then I will relay questions from the audience. You, as the audience, will be able to see and hear me and the speaker. You will have your microphone and camera switched off automatically, so at no time will you be heard or seen by anyone in the webinar. But of course, you're still able to communicate with us. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A option. Click on it, and when it opens, you'll have the chance to type questions. We'll try to cover as many of your questions as possible, though with time constraints, we might not be able to address everyone's question, but we will try to follow up afterwards with some of the questions that didn't get answered. And finally, I want to let you know that this event is being recorded and that we will post the recording on our website over the next few days. And now about the speaker. Many of you already know Peter Jones, either from his stints as Vice Provost, his work in his own department, which is the History and Philosophy of Science, or his frequent presence at alumni events. You may be surprised to hear that someone in HPS is going to speak about a modern novelist, but the archives fall under Peter's remit as fellow librarian, and he is particularly intimately familiar with our Bloomsbury holdings because he taught a summer school course on the subject for many years. He came up to King's as a graduate student in 1973, so he just missed meeting Forster. After a job in manuscripts at the British Library, he came back. He was elected Fellow Librarian of King's in 1985. So like Forster, he knows King's both as a student and as a fellow. Soon after he got made Fellow Librarian, Donald Perry, who was acting as Forster's literary executor, introduced Peter to the ins and outs of Forster's copyright, which Forster generously bequeathed to the college. Peter also inherited the job of introducing to students Forster's wonderfully illuminated copy of William Blake's Songs of Innocence and of Experience, which Forster gave on his 80th birthday to King's. We don't show it more than once a year for the fear of damaging it due to too much exposure to light. Peter lives more or less halfway between Forster's first digs as an undergraduate and his rooms as a fellow on A staircase, both of which will feature in this talk. Peter's knowledge of the Forster archive and legacy, his long service to King's, and his experience as Vice Provost in the care of resident bachelor dons all give Peter a rather unique insight into this subject. I'm delighted to introduce Peter Jones.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for your kind introduction, and welcome to everybody. I'm going to switch over in a few moments to a slide presentation, so then you'll be able to see some pictures, as well as me in the top right-hand corner, I expect. So this year is the 50th anniversary of Forster's death in 1970. I was scheduled to mark the anniversary occasion with a talk at the Legacy Lunch in King's in March, but here I am finally online via Zoom in September. Well, at least it's still the same anniversary year. So I propose to talk today about the two periods in Forster's life when he was resident in the college or nearby. And here I'm going to switch to screen, hopefully. Okay, I hope you can see the screen now. So these two periods were at the either end of his long life, 45 years apart. So obviously that accounts for the residence in my title. So what about reciprocity? Now, reciprocity, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is the reciprocation of cooperative or altruistic behavior. Now, for Forster, that probably means what he would call mutual kindness or friendship. In his first stay as an undergraduate in King's, he felt himself to be in receipt of unanticipated kindness from fellows, staff, and students, and thought of it ever after as a model for relationships between friends. During his second stay as an honorary fellow, he was unexpectedly given a refuge by the college after he'd been told he must lose his family home at West Hackhurst in Abingerhammer, Surrey, in just before his 65th birthday. And this is Forster outside Abingerhammer, sitting there with his dog. West Hackhurst had been designed by his father for Forster's Aunt Laura. Forster inherited the house, but not the land on which it stood. When the landlord wanted the land back, the sudden loss of his home, so soon after the death of his mother Lily in March 1945, upset Forster badly. In many different ways, material and immaterial, Forster tried to give back what he felt he owed the college in kindness, both as a result of his experience as a young man, but also as a return for being granted this refuge in later life. And you're looking now at a photograph of Forster, who's ringed in red, amongst students of Tunbridge School, from where he came up to King's. Earlier, you may have had the opportunity in the online exhibition to see original documents and photographs from the archives at King's, some of which will also illustrate this talk, like this one. And I thank our archivist, Patricia Mcguire, for her invaluable help, both with the talk and the exhibition. So you can see that at the bottom of this slide, Forster has written in his old age, Mr. Watson, who doubted my word in the 90s. And that's the schoolmaster in the centre at the bottom. In Michaelmas 1897, Forster and 47 others entered King's. He describes himself as a suburban day boy from a middling school. And this is Tunbridge School, as I said, day boys, 1897. When Forster arrived at King's, there were fewer than 200 undergraduates and 18 fellows in residence. His freshman lodgings were where the Guildhall now is in Market Square in Cambridge. The present Guildhall dates from 1939. Daily, he reported, I could be seen rushing up St. Edward's Passage to mingle with the larger flood which surged into the college itself. Forster admitted he found his first year at King's bewildering. In this first year, Forster worked, but not with much confidence, despite his having won an exhibition by examination. He went for bicycle rides, he attended chapel, he drank coffee, and played mild card games with friends after hall. He even went golfing with Tunbridge School acquaintances. For his first round of 9 holes, he shot 133. This is a picture of the maze at Cambridge in the year Forster came up in 1897. For a time, Forster took an interest in the King's boat, and for 3 successive days, he ran with the first boat in the Lents. But the most significant thing that happened in his first year occurred while bicycling near Madingley. He came upon an abandoned chalk pit with a copse of pines. In the shelter of the dell, he felt as if he discovered a separate magical world. In Forster's longest journey, his most autobiographical novel, this dell becomes a place of safety for the hero, Ricky Elliott, who retreats there to tell most things about my birth and parentage and education to his closest friends. This is a slide from Forster's journal for the month of March 1898. Something of the flavour of his first year at King's, as well as Forster's passion for music, can be found in his journal for this month. So I'm quoting from what you can see. Caught the 3:20 to Cambridge, all the station being altered. Mrs. P gave me eggs and buttonhole. After my arrival, I met McMunn. In evening, went to Haydn's Creation. How magnificent is, and there was light. Also a Beethoven symphony, rather marred by people talking dress. 10th of March, in the evening, went with Morse and Cowan to Joachim, sat in orchestra. First was Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata, which I did not enjoy as much as I might, as I'd never heard it before. Then a violin solo, a fugue of Bach, splendid. Borwick played Pretty Things by Chopin and Schumann, finished with Brahms' Trio. In his second year, Forster lived in Bodley's, and this slide shows Bodley's building. He lived in W7, which is the second staircase from the right at the top. And in the second year, Forster's life changed dramatically. Living in W7 with views both north and south of the college, he found his nearest neighbour was Hugh Owen Meredith, the model for George Emerson in A Room with a View, and Clive Durham in Morris. This is Meredith with Forster's mother, Lily, at West Hackhurst. Forster was deeply impressed by Meredith, a much bolder man and good-looking. Meredith's atheism ended Forster's shaky Christian belief. It was replaced with what Forster called Hellenism. Another friend was Edward Dent. He was one of those who was to remain friends with Forster for life. Dent played piano with Forster and invited him to the university's weekly chamber recitals. And this is Dent in May 1903. Another close friend for life was Malcolm Darling, who later travelled out to India with Forster and was his host on his second 1921 visit there. Forster wrote later in his biography of Goldsworthy Lois Dickinson about his third year, as Cambridge filled up with friends, it acquired a magical quality. Body and spirit, reason and emotion, work and play, architecture and scenery, laughter and seriousness, life and art. These pairs, which are elsewhere contrasted, were there fused into one. People and books reinforced one another. Intelligence joined hands with affection, speculation became a passion, and discussion was made profound by love. The most influential amongst the fellows on Forster was his tutor, Nathaniel Wedd. And this is Wedd a few years before Forster came up. Wedd smoked excessively. He had a huge walrus moustache and wore bright red ties. He was a radical Fabian in his youth, and he swore and blasphemed liberally. He was the one who encouraged Forster to write for the college magazine, Basiliona, which you can see a page now with a story by Forster. Forster adopted the pseudonym generally of Peer Gynt, and he wrote skits on bicycling and on grinds. This is the beginning of Forster's essay, later essay, My Books and I, and it tells about the influence of Wedd. He tells me that I might write, could write, might be a writer. I was amazed and yet not overawed. Like other great teachers of the young, Wedd always pointed to something already existing. He brought not only help, but happiness. Of course I could write. Not that anyone would read me, but that didn't signify. I had a special and unusual apparatus to which Wed called my attention. In an interview for The Listener later in 1959, Forster was specific about where this great event happened. It was Cambridge that first set me off writing, and in this very room on a staircase where I am now was at one time my tutor, a man called Wed, and it was he who suggested to me that I might write. He did it in a very informal way. He said in a sort of drawling voice, "I don't see why you shouldn't write." And I, being very diffident, was delighted at this remark and thought, after all, why shouldn't I write? And I did. It is really owing to Wed and to that start at Cambridge that I have written. I might have started, I suppose, for some other reason. Something of the relaxation and enjoyment Forster felt in his second and particularly his third year, he later declared that the college really belongs to third years, can be seen in this passage from The Longest Journey about the hero. In the morning, he had read Theocritus, whom he believed to be the greatest of Greek poets. He had lunched with a merry Don and had tasted Zwieback biscuits. Then he had walked with people he liked and had walked just long enough. And now his room was full of other people whom he liked, and when they left, he would go and have supper with Ansel, whom he liked as well as anyone. Forster decided, because of his happiness, to stay on for a fourth year after he'd got an upper second in finals, and to change from classics to history. He had hoped to be taught by Goldsworthy Lois Dickinson, but Oscar Browning, pictured here, insisted on Forster's coming to him. Patrick Wilkinson described Oscar Browning's interest in his students as a kind of soul fingering. Academically, and in terms of Forster's literary development, Oscar Browning was, however, of no use. This is Forster in his lodgings at 12 King's Parade in his fourth year at King's. It was there he actually began to write Nottingham Lace, the first fiction that he later abandoned. And here we have a slide which shows the minute book of the Apostles' Society. In this year, Forster was considered for membership of the Apostles, a secret society then of King's and Trinity undergraduates, meeting to discuss and debate such topics as truth, God, and ethics. And you can see on the left that he was nominated by his friend Hugh Meredith to become a member of the society, and thus become, in apostolic terms, what they called an embryo. On the 9th of February 1901, he was elected an apostle sponsored by Meredith. But 4 months later, he left Cambridge. For the rest of his life, his Cambridge was essentially an apostolic one. And this is the list of those meeting at an apostles' dinner in London in 1910. And you can see amongst the members there, Forster himself, of course, but also Roger Fry, John Maynard Keynes, Rupert Brooke, and many others. This is the beginning of Forster's longest journey. The first sentence begins, "The cow is there." And we get our best sense of how Forster felt about the apostles from this opening scene of the longest journey, which is evidently a picture of a Saturday evening at the society. Halfway down the page, you can see a paragraph that begins, "It was philosophy. They were discussing the existence of objects. Do they exist only when there is someone to look at them? Or have they a real existence of their own? It is all very interesting, but at the same time, it is difficult. Hence the cow. She seemed to make things easier. She was so familiar, so solid, that surely the truths that she illustrated would in time become familiar and solid also. Is the cow there or not? This was better than deciding between objectivity and subjectivity. Forster said of his hero, Ricky, that in 1 year he had made many friends and learnt much, and he might learn even more if he could but concentrate his attention on that cow. 15 years before Forster came up to King's, this is Goldsworthy Lois Dickinson, and he was a prominent member of the Apostles, and it was as a member of the Apostles that Forster and Lois Dickinson grew close. And Forster was to write Lois Dickinson's biography in 1934. And this is a shot of Lois Dickinson about 15 years after Forster came up to King's. Forster became a member of Dickinson's Discussion Society. In Christmas 1912, after Forster had been out of Cambridge some time and teaching and writing in London, he made a trip to India with Goldsworthy Lois Dickinson and his other friend, Malcolm Fraser. And what we're looking at here is a slide of the guest house they stayed at. And that may be the female figure in the very center in white, maybe Josie Darling, wife of Malcolm Darling, on the balcony. And this first visit, of course, began Forster's writing of A Passage to India, which he was only to complete in 1924, after a second visit to India in 1921. And this is a slide of a photograph of Forster as secretary to the Maharaja of Divas Senior in India in 1921. Forster's wearing the turban on the left and the Maharajas in the center. A Passage to India was the last of his novels published during his lifetime. And now I'm going to move on to the second part of Forster's residence in King's, when he was elected to a fellowship there in 1946. He was told he was not to undertake any duties, simply to be himself in college. From 1946 onwards, he lived in Cambridge with Patrick Wilkinson, and this is he, at 32 Trumpington Street, and this lasted until 1953. Forster used to head off to college about noon, after spending a lot of time in the morning taking a reflective bath. And this is a slide of his study cum sitting room on A staircase. His study in King's was on A, where the common room of the graduate suite now is, with 2 windows looking out over Chetwynd Court. Forster kept his flat in London in Chiswick, and he used to go down there by train and tube once a week or so. He wrote in 1947 in his diary, and you're looking at the page here, that his rented rooms at 32 Trumpington Street had the best of the Japanese prints Masood, that is his first Indian friend, gave me. Stuck above the frame, a little piece of holly from West Hackhurst, i.e. from Pine Copse, for I have lost West Hackhurst since this book was opened last. He did a little college teaching in King's in English literature, but not much, and he invited the Apostles regularly to meet in his study. What you're looking at here is the fire mantle that his father built at West Hackhurst, and which Forster carried off with him from West Hackhurst to King's. This is what it looked like in the drawing room at West Hackhurst, but it then became the centerpiece of the study sitting room at King's. And this is what it looks like today as part of the graduate suite in A Staircase in Kings. In 1953, the Wilkinsons moved house, and it was decided, precedent or no precedent, that Forster should be given a bedroom in college, connected to his study. This overlooked the front court, where the graduate computer room now is. It was important to Forster's well-being that he could continue to travel out and return to Cambridge, all the more so once he was living in the college. The most important of his travels was the 1947 trip to America. His visit to the USA lasted 3 months. The object was to have universities pay him to speak and so to visit his friends. This is one of them, Bill Rurik. Bill and his partner Tom Coley picked him up at LaGuardia Airport when Forster flew to New York. They belonged to the New York theatre milieu. They were both actors. Bill and Tom regarded Forster as a kind of guru, and Forster responded to the bohemian side of New York life with its confident gay subculture. Other friends he made in New York were Paul Cadmus, the artist, and another artist, Jerry French, who you see here on a visit to King's in 1950 with Forster. And this is Jerry's wife, Margaret, who again was a painter. And here they are sitting on a bench in front of the Gibbs building. The playwright, Matthew Lopez, has recently dramatized Forster and his New York friends in his 2-part play, The Inheritance, which had a very successful runs in London and New York. It was running on Broadway until the lockdown in March. The plot of The Inheritance is based on Forster's Howard's End, as indeed was Zadie Smith's novel On Beauty. But in Lopez's play, Forster himself is an on-stage presence, supporting and guiding the younger men. Once back in London after his 1947 visit, Forster was eager to bring his American friends to Cambridge and to London. This is Forster sitting in his study in King's. He settled into a William Morris chair, covered himself with a lap rug, and began to tackle the mountain of correspondence that had accumulated. There were drafts of radio talks that he had to give to the BBC Indian service, where Malcolm Darling was now a producer. "I seem to be a great man," he wrote to another friend, Joe Ackerley. "My fame is much more of a pleasure than a nuisance, but being an important person is almost a full-time job." This is another shot of the study showing some of the pictures. In the study were portraits and engravings of his Thornton ancestors by George Richmond and others. And there were 2 William Morris armchairs, shabby and often swathed in knitted shawls. His grandfather's freestanding bookcase was also in the study. We know what it was like to visit Forster in his rooms in King's. And here I would like to thank Robin Morrish for his kindness in allowing me to quote from his reminiscences of his friendship with Forster, given as a talk to the King's College Association in July 2004, and now preserved with the Forster papers in the archives. Robin was one of the choral scholars in the last 4 years of the 1950s. Robin remembers being offered Earl Grey tea and Madeira cake at 5:15 every Wednesday afternoon in term time. Here I quote from Robin's reminiscences. "As a study, the college provided Forster with a well-proportioned room in William Wilkins' neo-Gothic building, with 2 large windows facing south over Chetwynd Court. This was the room where we choral scholars took tea with him on Wednesdays. A tall, broad wooden structure with pigeonholes for ornaments was installed, designed by his architect father. The oval walnut dining table, you can see it here, had been the nursery table of the Forster family since the end of the 18th century. There were all sorts of other oddments, most of them valued for their associations, such as an Indian musical instrument, which visitors were allowed to twang. We invariably did. He would benignly serve us tea from his armchair, and we would gather around the oval walnut dining table. The other furniture in the room seemed to have just settled around him, rather than to have been deliberately chosen and arranged. He always listened. He didn't talk. But he mostly liked to talk to undergraduates alone. A shy one might be taken to a concert to start with. With one freshman, John Eliot Gardner, he went to tea every week. Shy or angular students, the Ricky Elliots of today, he regarded as a challenge, but he also had a soft spot for the outrageous, the Stephen Wanhams, perhaps admiring them because he was not like that himself. He rarely missed a Sunday evening concert in the college hall. His 80th birthday celebrations continued with a special concert with music chosen by himself. It included Beethoven's Coriolan Overture, Haydn's Trumpet Concerto, and the symphonic variations by César Franck. It so happened that I had the privilege of leading the orchestra. That's the end of the quote from Robin. One of the first of the undergraduates Forster befriended at King's was Eric Fletcher, a miner's son from Doncaster. Forster stayed in touch with Eric for the rest of his life and visited him when Eric was head of higher education colleges in Keighley and Barnet. Through the Apostles' meetings, Forster met Nick Furbank, then a research fellow at Emmanuel, and Nick, of course, was to become his first biographer. Forster was keen to make friends with Indian students at King's in particular. Patrick Wilkinson reckoned there were about 80 of them between 1945 and 1972. Forster was also an object of pilgrimage for visiting Indian writers. And here you can see Forster next to the astrophysicist Jayant Vishnu Narlikar, KC 1963, and his brother visiting. And he delighted in introducing them to others at King's. He often helped Indian writers with finding publishers for their English language writings, and he wrote prefaces for their books. But it was not all tea parties and excursions. While at King's, Forster started to look through the letters and diaries from his Indian visits that he had taken away from West Hackhurst. These he turned into a volume, The Hill of Davy, published in 1953. Likewise, his family history came to the fore again, resulting in his writing Marianne Thornton, a domestic biography. And here she's shown around 1830 by George Richmond, a picture by George Richmond. This life of his great aunt was published in 1956. He also wrote a sketch of West Hackhurst, never published in his lifetime. His American friendships emboldened him to write a short story, The Other Boat, which dealt with a relationship between a white passenger and a half-caste. Although, like his novel Morris, which he was still revising, it could not be published in England until after his death. His friendship with Benjamin Britten led Forster to his collaborating with Eric Crozier, shown here with Forster, on the libretto of Britten's opera Billy Budd. Forster had to spend some months of convalescence after an operation in 1951 at Aldborough. Working with Britten challenged him creatively, but also exasperated, as work on the opera had to be fitted in with Britten's fantastically busy life as a conductor and impresario, and his work on other commissions. Forster had good friends amongst the King's Fellowship too. He was close to Kenneth Harrison, shown here, mathematician and lay dean, and an expert on the chapel's stained glass. Forster also played a role within debates in the college governing body about keeping old buildings and building new ones. This is a slide of the Central Hotel, once in St. Edward's Passage. In 1960, the college decided to demolish the dilapidated 17th century Central Hotel on St. Edward's Passage and build Market Hostel. This was preceded by a public outcry and much debate. Provost Noel Annan kept a file on the subject, which includes part of a letter Forster wrote arguing for the preservation of the Central Hotel. Forster valued it not for aesthetic or anecdotal reasons, he said, but because it is an essential part of a small but exquisite complex. If we demolish it, the complex vanishes. No modern building, however tactful, can replace it. We shall provide another example of the tidying up and dulling down that afflicts Cambridge and other old places. Forster, in fact, was unable to attend the relevant congregation vote, and the college reported that the decision to demolish the Central Hotel was unanimous. The year before this debate, in 1959, Forster had celebrated his 80th birthday with a lavish party given by kings and attended by many of his friends and literary celebrities. In return, Forster gave his copy of William Blake's Songs of Innocence and of Experience to the college to mark the birthday occasion. It was a magnificent present and is probably the most valuable single thing in the college library. This is the Songs of Innocence and of Experience title page. Forster's copy is commonly reckoned as one of the finest of them all, and a colour facsimile of this manuscript was made for the Tate Gallery and the William Blake Trust in 1991. Forster inherited the original book from his Aunt Laura, to whom it was left by her father, Charles Forster. Charles was curate to John Jebb, Bishop of Limerick, who bequeathed it to him. Jebb had bought it from Catherine Blake, William's widow, in 1830. So Forster's copy can be traced all the way back to Blake's studio. We know it was made there in 1825 or just after because of the watermarks in the paper that Blake used in this copy. And this is, these are the letters from Morgan Forster to Tim Munby, the librarian, giving the book to the college, and a letter to Morgan Forster himself from his Aunt Laura giving it to him in 1923. The illuminated copies of the Songs of Innocence and of Experience were hand-coloured in Blake's studio from the relief-etched monochrome impressions printed on his own rolling press. Forster's many other gifts to the library also included some of his other books inherited from Aunt Laura. And here I'm going to borrow from a blog about these books written by Anna Cook, our assistant librarian. Some of the volumes, formerly owned by Laura, are especially interesting since they feature bindings with blind-tooled and stamped leatherwork of her own design. These include a volume by John Ruskin on the medieval Italian artist Giotto, which has a design based around circles, making reference to Giotto's reputed ability to draw a perfect circle freehand without the aid of a compass. It's possible that Laura's designs were influenced by her association with the arts and crafts designer William Morris, with whom she's known to have corresponded and sent samples of her work. The Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society exhibit for 1889 featured several of Laura's book bindings and also embossed leather chair seats produced by Morris & Co. from her designs. Another work bound by her is a 3-volume set of the life and letters of Charles Darwin, which was given to Laura by the editor, Darwin's son Francis, and features a floral design based on poppies. And this is a letter from Charles Darwin, which came with the book, written, as you can see, from Down House, thanking Laura for letting him stay in her house, West Hackhurst. This set of Darwin is one of the jewels of the Forster collection, since it has these letters attached inside from Charles Darwin. In late May 1970, Forster, aged 91, had a final stroke in his rooms in King's. Nick Furbank had moved into rooms below and heard him fall and cry out. He was moved from King's so that his closest friends, the Buckinghams, could look after him at their house in Coventry, and that's where he died. He left most of his personal effects to individuals, in order as he wanted that his rooms not become a place of pilgrimage. There was a long-standing formal understanding that the BAs, the graduates, would have a priority claim on at least part of Morgan Forster's set when it became available. And so it came to pass with the creation of the graduate common room on A staircase. And this is the bottom of Forster's will. Forster bequeathed his papers and the copyrights in his own writings to King's College in 1970, subject to a life interest of his friend Sebastian Sprott, who in fact died in 1971. The considerable archive of papers is now in the Archive Centre at King's and contains drafts of most of his novels and his other writings, along with a lot of photograph albums and letters from his vast correspondence. The Forster archive is still one of the most heavily used collections in the King's archives, visited in normal times by scholars from all over the world. And Forster would have been pleased to know how many of these come from India. Copyright in Forster's writings has been of great value to the college financially, and will continue to be so while that copyright lasts. The Merchant Ivory films of the novels are probably the best known of the many screen, stage, and TV adaptations of Forster, and you're looking at a section of the script from A Room with a View. Last year, there was a very successful TV version of Howard's End, and other film, TV, and stage productions are in the pipeline now. The college, in return, organised and supported the publication of the definitive Abinger edition of E.M. Forster's writings, beginning with the first volume in 1972 and completed in 16 separate works in 2004. And this is Morris, that was published in 1999. So this has been an account not just of Forster's two widely separated periods of residence in King's, but of the many gifts Forster gave to the college and to the friends he made there, and of the different ways in which the college and its people nurtured, looked after, and celebrated him. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that very interesting discussion, talk. I'll read some questions that have come in. The first one is from David Mollison, King's 1966. Where did Forster live in his first year? I think you mentioned that.
Yes, the building no longer exists, but it was on the site of what is now the Guildhall in Cambridge, which was built in 1939 and replaced the building in which Forster's first lodgings were.
Were they owned by the college or were they private lodgings?
They were private lodgings, so he had a landlady, but they were extraordinarily convenient, of course, being in the market square. So as he wrote, he could simply dash down St. Edward's Passage and he would be in King's within moments of leaving his lodging. So very convenient indeed.
Indeed. There's another question. Forster wrote a short story in 1909 called The Machine Stops, which has periodically been rediscovered, and it was last published in an edition in 2013. Can you say a word about that and its relevance especially under lockdown and the isolation people are feeling these days?
Yes, this story, it's a very short story called The Machine Stops, is really, I suppose, Forster's only attempt at what we might now call science fiction. But what's most striking about it is it envisages a world in which everybody has retreated underground and they're serviced by a giant machine. So they live in, as it were, little pods under the ground, and all their needs are satisfied by the machine. And they communicate with each other by what seems remarkably like Zoom. That's to say, a kind of videoing device in which you can share conversations with people in other pods all over the globe. So the story is really a story of lockdown, if you like, and it's one in which Zoom plays a big part. And it's a typically moral tale, a Forsterian take on the future, in which this dependence on the machine is shown to be, in effect, dooming humanity to its own destruction. There are two main characters in the story. One of them, the son, who's living in his own pod, one day goes adventuring outside the pod and discovers a way to the surface and discovers the natural world outside on the globe. And he comes back and excitedly reports this to his mother. And she at first refuses to believe him and then tells him he's a fool for trying to escape from this wonderful world they've created, this safe environment under the earth. But of course, in the end, the story ends with the machine, for its own reasons, deciding to stop, and humanity no longer able to live on the surface of the earth because they have forgotten how to breathe for themselves, is doomed. And the story ends with the mother and son both dying as the machine stops. So in a way, it's a very prescient tale about over-dependence on technology, but it's also about Forster's very real and passionate attachment to the natural world, which he felt was being almost eaten up by modern civilization in England and elsewhere. So it's also a testimony to his extraordinary passion for the English countryside and for nature. And I should add, it's because of it being so relevant to what's going on right now, there's huge interest at the moment in turning it into a TV series, a radio series, and goodness knows what else.
Right. I'm not surprised. Here's another question. This one came from Adam in the development office. Forster cuts an image of an archetypal bachelor Don, and he embraced many of Cambridge's traditions and benefits. Does his willingness to address colonization and homosexuality make him a man out of his time?
Yes. I mean, it's characteristic of Forster to be both the very essence of a bachelor don, as you describe it, in his personal habits and lifestyle, and his very quiet way of carrying on, but also subversively to engage with things which were not comfortable and donnish and quiet, things like colonization, and in particular the exploitation of India, which of course plays such a huge role in the novel A Passage to India, but also played a huge role in forming the bonds between Forster and so many of his Indian friends who came to visit him here at King's and who he kept in touch with the whole of his life. And homosexuality, of course, was another subversive thing. He couldn't write, or at least publish explicitly about homosexuality during his lifetime, although he wrote a variety of short stories on gay subjects, including the one I mentioned in the talk about the boat. And of course, his other novel, Morris, which wasn't published until after Forster's death, but which he circulated amongst friends during his lifetime. So many people got to see the novel and knew about it, but it couldn't be published because of the laws in England up until 1967, at least. So Forster was not afraid to engage with matters which were far from being, as I say, quiet, donnish things. He was also the chair of the International PEN, the Society for Protecting Writers and Supporting Writers, and championed many writers who were imprisoned or otherwise persecuted all over the world. So Forster may have been, in some ways, archetypal sort of donnish figure in his habits, but in his engagement with liberal values across this wide front, he was very willing to speak his mind insofar as he could legally, and to engage in public debate and to broadcast and to make statements and write letters and make himself a nuisance to the powers that be on these subjects that he felt passionately about.
During the talk, Tom Banfield wrote in and said, with hindsight, King's was made for Forster and vice versa. And to me, I don't know King's that well, but I would say that at least subversiveness, I don't know if he learned the gentleness, particularly at King's. Dickinson, I think, was a gentle person, but that subversiveness, I think perhaps King's may have given him the nerve to speak out. Do you think?
Yes, I think it's certainly, I mean, he always thought of his period as an undergraduate at King's, the 4 years he spent at King's, as the place, as the time that, as it were, made him, turned him from this rather browbeaten schoolboy, frightened of himself and lacking totally in confidence, into someone who was willing to meet the world. And of course, through the apostles and through his participation in Bloomsbury, which was really in some ways an extension of King's as far as Forster was concerned, his membership of the apostles and his friendships with the Bloomsbury Circle. That was how, as it were, his world broadened from King's, but basically King's was where that all began, and all of it can be traced back to his time at King's and his membership of the Apostles' Society.
Do you know if there was a family or a school connection that made him come to King's, pick King's?
Actually, I don't think I do know what the connection may have been. He felt when he arrived at King's that he needed to cling to some of the other old Tunbridgians scattered across Cambridge, and most of them were not at King's. So in his first year, as I said in the talk, he sort of hung out and even played golf and drank coffee with these old Tunbridgians just because they were the world he came from. But as he got confident, he began to drop those people, well, not so much drop them, he was far too polite and nicer person to do that. But they began to play a secondary role in his life compared to the friends he made at King's. So in Forster's mind, there was a big gap, as it were, between Tunbridge and King's. And you can see this very clearly in The Longest Journey, where the character Ricky Elliott comes from just such a school and has the identical experience as Forster in coming to King's and suddenly discovering a new world and leaving his old public school self behind.
So, question from Paul Mcguire about that. If The Longest Journey is the most autobiographical of Forster's novels, does that suggest that as an undergraduate, he felt intellectually insecure like Ricky, and yet he was admitted to the Apostles?
Yes. And I think you can see the whole spectrum actually in his diaries of his time at King's, where, you know, he starts off very diffident and not sure of himself and why he's there and what he's doing, and then becomes more and more confident, so that by his third year he has made friends and, you know, he's beginning to feel comfortable. And in the fourth year he's a member of the Apostles, and that is the pathway to his life after King's for Forster, really. So you can see that evolution happening from, you know, the timid little schoolboy to the not exactly confident young man who left King's, but somebody who was straight away willing to throw himself, after leaving Cambridge, into teaching for the Working Men's Association in London, and beginning to lecture widely on art and literature, and to take up as a private tutor, but also to start writing. So, you know, he jumped straight in with his novels, and his first novels are published remarkably soon after his first trip to Italy at the end of his time at King's.
So he must have got some confidence. Susie Dakin, King's 1995. What happened to the Apostles?
It still carries on. In the 1970s, the Apostles became a society which was no longer just men. It also widened out in becoming not just King's and Trinity, but the society is still in existence, and the archives of the Apostles have, as Patricia well knows, have ended up in King's College in the so-called Ark, and we are still given the minute books of the Apostles at intervals. So the connection with King's is maintained insofar as King's is the place where the archives of the Apostles are kept. But as far as I know, the society flourishes even in lockdown as we speak.
John Mira asked two questions. The first one's for you. Did Forster spend much time in Italy to get the inspiration for Room with a View?
Yes, he and his mother spent, I suppose, about 8 or 9 months, I think, in Italy. So it was quite a long visit. And of course, they stayed in the famous Pensione in Florence, which is the basis for A Room with a View. But they also visited Rome and went elsewhere in Italy, and Forster kept his diary so that we know about his travels in Italy and the people he met. He was slightly infuriated to be tied to his mum, in the sense that, you know, he couldn't go off and meet young men or anything like that, and he couldn't branch out on his own because he was essentially his mother's escort. So he found that a bit frustrating, although he did love his mother deeply. But he did have a wonderful time in Italy, and it formed the basis for 2 of his novels, that visit to Italy immediately after he left King's.
The other question is, are there any audio recordings of Forster's talks? And I don't know the answer to that. I know that we have a recording of him reading think one of his short stories called The Road to Colossus. And I suspect that on YouTube, you might be able to get some of his talks. And if there are any audio recordings of his broadcasts, they'd probably be in the BBC archives. Do you know if there are any anywhere else?
Yeah, I think that's right. The BBC's sound archives are the place where the original recordings are kept. The transcripts of many of the recordings were made, and a number of those have been published, in fact, as talks by Forster. So we do know quite a lot about his career as a speaker, and he was one of the best known voices on radio in his time, particularly during the Second World War. He was called on by the BBC to, as it were, speak for England, and he did so over dozens, if not hundreds, of broadcasts. And after the war, he spoke largely on the BBC's Indian service. So he spoke a lot to an audience in India, broadcast audience.
Okay. I know somebody's published some of those BBC broadcast talks as well, about 10 years ago. We'll take one more quick question. Alan Shepard, a friend of the college, are there other papers and materials of Forster, especially of his time at Alexandria, that are yet to be published? Not that I know of, other than the fact that he wrote to an awful lot of people, and those letters have generally not been published, and we have many of them.
Yes, and of course many of his essays about his time in India were published in Pharos and Varion and his Guide to Alexandria. But archivally, I think, as you say, there may be letters that he wrote from Alexandria during his time there that are scattered around the globe, but I don't think there is an archive of Forster in Egypt, other than that in King's already.
Okay, we'll wrap it up now. I want to put in a plug for the exhibition, which is part of the Digital Alumni Week, which you can go and see from Digital Alumni Week. And thank you all for attending and for your interesting questions. And thank you very much to Peter for such an interesting talk.
Thank you, and goodbye, everybody.
Bye.